Wow. Whew. I wish to express my gratitude, and I'm truly humbled by the outpouring of interest and passion, I think, in Dallas. The Dallas Architecture Forum is actually something you don't realize, but it is actually spoken about far and wide internationally as an amazing place to be among architects. So I think to Nate and to everybody else, this talk is about 2 or 3 years in the making, so I think I should have been here 3 years ago. But I want to just really express a huge thanks for this venue and being able to sort of talk about what we're passionate about, which is the work I'm about to show you. I also think it's actually pretty amazing that I Am Pei turned 100. I have a small I Am Pei story, one in which when I was a student at University of Virginia, he received the Thomas Jefferson Medal, which is the highest honor that the university gives out. And here came this gentleman. This is about 25 years ago, so he would have been about 75 at that time. And he was bubbly and joyous and was just so thankful to talk about his work. At that point, he said one of the most important projects in his entire life was at Choate University or a Choate School in New England. There's a girls' school and a boys' school, or the dorms were sort of separate. And he was supposed to place a new building on the campus, and the campus architect had given him a place to place this building. And so he went to the site, and he started walking around the entire site. And he went back to the campus architect, and he said, "I don't think that that's the right site for this building." It was like the student center. And he goes, "Last night, or yesterday, I walked around the site, and I discovered a path that was basically in a grassy field that was a beeline between the boys' dorm and the girls' dorm. And it was just this beaten down path. And he goes, "I think this student center will be much better if we place it right in the middle of that path." And then he actually made a kind of a square, but then it was sliced with a path that went through the building, and so then it became these like two triangles that were sort of shifted from each other. And it is the heart of the school. And I sat there, I listened to it, and I just remember that, you know, to think about architecture in terms of just how people actually use space, to be that observant and to sort of, you know, that never left me. So I hope also that you find that in our work you find these dirt paths that move through some of our projects. So I would like to talk about BIG, or Bjarke Ingels Group, with, you know, I think there might be a perception of what we do and who we are versus, of course, in many respects, what we're actually doing. If I were to tell you that the website that you may or may not have seen is really only about, I'd say, probably less than 20% of the work that we're actually active in or that we have produced. In many cases, books like Yes is More or Hot to Cold are also sort of scratching the surface in terms of what we actually spend our day doing. And I know that that's also the case for many of you. So what I'd like to do is to kind of pull back and really do a little bit of a deep dive into a lot of different projects. So this is our office in Copenhagen. It's an old brewery factory, and then we have, of course, New York, and we opened an office in London last year. We're now numbering about 460 architects between the three offices. I'd like to start with sort of some old work, older, sort of 15 years old, to ground you in both kind of where we come from and the kind of thinking that went into these projects. Also to note that in the first 15 years of BIG and Plot, that was the office prior to BIG that Bjarke and Julien had founded, there was only really one project a year that was completed. The past 6 months, we've actually completed 6 projects. So the type of volume of work that was produced over the first 15, 16 years was actually not a lot of volume. It was really just getting started. It's kind of, I think also, our profession takes so long to actually get things built and permitted and sort of financed and all of those things. So there are many projects that we have been working on for 5, 6, 10 years and that are just starting to finish. This was a housing project called the VM Houses, and it was completed in 2004. And it was a project that was very, very important to the office. It was the first real architectural project. Prior to this, there had been a bathing platform, the Copenhagen Harbor Baths, and a youth center, the Maritime Youth House. So this is 250 apartments, not a small project. And I think one thing to realize is just, how the question often is, how did Bjarke, Julien at that point, how did they really start their office? And I'm going to tell you that story right now. So if you look at this project, when the original owner had it, he had a great idea. And his idea was, I'm going to hire some young architects because they're cheap. And so that was his only reason for hiring these like 25, 27-year-old bushy-haired architects. And he had a site that was so large, he actually hired 4 architects. Each one was given a quadrant, northeast, sort of southeast, northwest, southwest. And they were to each build a residential kind of building with a centralized core and units on the corners. And so Bjarke and Julien with Plot received only one of these corners, so they were only to really build about 60 units, 70 units. And Bjarke came in the first sort of workshop session, and he said, I've got this great idea. If you build 4 houses, towers, they're all going to kind of like look into each other, and it's kind of strange to have bedrooms that are all, it's not very nice. If you give me 2 of the towers, I can put a V, and that way those people are kind of like looking past all of the other kind of buildings that are close by. And the client liked it. He goes, okay, then I'll have 3 architects, and you can have the V. And so then Bjarke came back 2 weeks later, and he goes, you know what? If you give me the other 2 towers, I'll create an M, and then everyone will look past each other, and they won't look into each other's bedrooms. And the guy's like, great, I only have 1 architect. That's all I need. So it was basically given a chance, and then in a way, finding a way through the architecture, through the reasoning that was important to this client, to kind of talk about how to actually to get that project, that scope, that scale that no one would ever have received. He was at that time about 28 years old. Which many students coming out of school are sort of in their mid-20s. The other thing is to realize that many things that you actually see are actually value engineering exercises, that dreaded word. So this is a facade, and it has triangular balconies, and everyone kind of recognizes it as like the face of the VM house. But what if I told you that this actually had rectilinear balconies to begin with? 2 points of connection at the base, and then 2 struts to connect it to the top. So there were 4 points of connection through the facade for each balcony. The client didn't have a lot of money, needed to save some money, and said, I need to save this much. So we came up with, okay, we'll make the triangular balcony. It'll have 2 points of connection at the base and only 1 strut, and thus saving 80 struts and 80 points of connection. And the client loved it. And the client loved it not because he was saving money. He goes, you know what? I'm going to actually be able to bring people into these apartments. They're going to walk out to the edge and they're going to say, I'm king of the world. And so it was also kind of strange to see how suddenly a cost-saving exercise was actually turning into a marketing kind of idea for the entire building. Needless to say, also what's interesting about these balconies is that in most cases you find balconies, repetitious. They're sort of one over the other. There's also maybe a desire not to be seen by your neighbors when you're out there. These are exactly the opposite. This is creating a vertical landscape, a brand new type of space where everybody kind of sees each other while they're grilling or while they're out playing. And this actually new vertical landscape even allows you, when you're sort of cooking on your balconies and say you don't have any salt, you can sort of yell down, hey, do you have any salt? And then they start to sort of, from one to the other, they hand it up all the way to where the meat is. And so it's also finding new territory in very traditional buildings. These are developer-led spec housing projects. There was no money to really make it. And even when you sort of started looking inside the units, they're built with very sort of inexpensive materials. There are no demising walls because you basically just had a through unit and you allowed for the tenants to place in their own walls. If they liked the kind of loft look, they kept it. If they had children or such, then they could build their own walls or needed an office. And then also take a look, like one of the things that is most precious in Denmark is daylight. And so if you look at the stair treads, those are perforated. The daylight comes in and actually goes through the stair treads. Just little things of actually trying to maximize different qualities that you have. So the client actually sold those 250 units in 3 weeks. This was 2004, so very different sort of market conditions. He purchased the site next door, and there we created the Mountain. Now the Mountain is a very different type of unit. So the city in Denmark has a master plan, and you are supposed to follow the master plan. The master plan had asked for the yellow to be parking, a parking garage, and the blue to be a housing project. And we were like, this isn't very nice. The first sort of 3 to 4 floors look directly into a parking garage. That's not somewhere that you're going to sort of want to live. So we went back to the city and we asked questions like, what if you use the parking as a base? And what if you place the housing on top? What if you cut away exactly those views that we were so incessant about in the first project? So you're actually taking, square feet away from the client in that case, but you're making an argument for the value that that has in the other projects, the adjacent projects. 80 units that are all south-facing, and you create a new hybrid type of building that includes 450 parking spaces. So it's called the Mountain, and we decided to perforate the metal around the parking because air has to move through a parking garage. And then, while we're at it, why not just, instead of perfing it with one diameter hole, we use 6 different diameter holes, and we perforate it with Mount Everest, an image of Mount Everest. So you're in the flattest country of Europe, Denmark, but you're living on top of Mount Everest. And the parking garage is 7 levels that ramp up. And we discovered that if you were using traditional up-down elevators, you would need 7 traditional elevators to service 80 units. No one in their right mind would do that. So we actually had to come up with a new type of elevator, and we decided, well, let's use a funicular, an elevator, a single one that just moves up with the units, and thus you can service all 11 stories with a single elevator. Yet there weren't any funicular elevator providers in Denmark because it's flat. And so we had to call up Switzerland. And we said, do you have a funicular for us? And the guy's like, where are you calling from? Denmark. He's like, I have to see this. So he flew up, and he looked at our model, and he looked at the project. He's like, I love this project. We're going to do it, and I'm going to give you a good price. And so we put in the first funicular in Denmark into the building, And it's like a joyride. All the kids want to actually live there so they can take the funicular up to the units. And now the guy selling the funiculars has this project on his brochure on the front page, and it says, "We deliver funiculars everywhere in the world, ... including Denmark." So it's also kind of like you have to sometimes think outside of what you're used to or what you have access to in terms of materials and construction techniques, and maybe import them from other places. So everything on the car side is very metallic, very colorful, just like the cars themselves. As you move into your unit, things turn different. They become natural woods, they become sort of neutral in terms of the view, and really everything is emphasized on the outside, the landscape. You have a 1,200 square foot interior, and you have 600 square feet terrace. You can take your finger and sort of open up the sliding glass doors and really have a suburban lifestyle 11 stories up in the air. So it's a very different type of project, because what we're trying to do here is take the qualities of suburbia, which is having a single family detached house, being able to send the kids in and out, and it's safe, pets are able to run out, and we wanted to, Denmark is a place that has a finite amount of land, so they can't just suburbanize the rest of Denmark. It just can't. So we tried to take the qualities of suburbia and basically densify it. So you have the same ability to move in and outdoors, you have the safety, you have the light and all of those things, the nature, the bushes, the trees, but now in a much more denser sort of space. So that's really sort of, and I think that's a valid architectural prototype also for a place like Dallas, where you go from suburbia, and here you come into the city and it goes straight up in glass. And maybe there are actually some middle kind of projects that could bridge between the suburban projects and the high-rises and things that you have downtown. We did very well for the second project with the same client, so we actually then got a third, which is the 8 House right here in the front. Now the 8 House, this is this new area in Copenhagen that 50,000 people will be living here. 50,000 people will also be working in different parts. And what you see is that this is a direct reaction or a direct sort of outcome because of the 60s and 70s suburbanization kind of was just eating up the land all over Denmark. The construction technique in Denmark is that 90% of all construction is prefabricated concrete elements. All structure, all floors, many walls, everything, fascia, facade material, roof, is all precast concrete because the seasonality is it's so short to actually work outside on sites. And so it's like Lego. You order different pieces, they get delivered to the site, and then the cranes just pop them into place. It allows for a kind of a new way of thinking about a project. If a project like this, the 8 House, which has no parking, 500 units, and sorry, there's no laser here, nope. We touch on the ground with ramps on 3 places, and then the units are actually moving up so that you can ride your bicycle up to the 10th level apartment just with the ramps. Every unit is actually going up about 18 inches from the next one. And so it's pretty remarkable, but this is because it's possible. If it was a site cast building, this would be impossible, the amount of work and all the form work. Because this was all done in a factory, the pieces were just sort of pre-ordered, everything was put into place, it's all Lincoln logs, it actually became possible to do a building this complex. 500 units, 125 unit types. There are probably realtors sitting out there going, oh my God. They actually have to work. My question to the realtor world is, why do buildings that are like residential towers only have 4 or 6 building like unit types? And then I love the names, the eclectic, the modernist, the classic. Like they are shoehorning all of us, this beautiful, wonderful, multi-faceted crowd out here, into 6 unit types. So our feeling is that life is bountiful, and thus all unit types should be bountiful. There are families with 1 mom, 3 kids. There's you need many bedrooms, you need fewer bedrooms, your family changes, and so you need to create that variety in the buildings. So you have, in this case, shops and commercial space. You have row houses, you have flats, and you have penthouses. So we use different types of living and different types of working to create this ability to kind of move up and down. This is the southernmost point of Copenhagen, meaning the city limits end at the building. And then it's a nature preserve. So this is also where you can just send your kids out and they will actually be able to play. The other thing that I really appreciate about this whole new master plan is that all of the rainwater is actually not put into canalization or into pipes. It's all collected, it's all surface driven, and then it gets placed into retention ponds or large ponds, and then it just evaporates up. So think about what we do. So also the units that look at the water, people pay more money for units looking at water than dirt. It's a human condition. And when you actually think that we take rainwater, which has value, people prize it, and we actually put it underground, and then we have problems because we didn't size the pipes large enough, and it's just headache after headache. Imagine if we actually designed and master planned our cities so that there were buildings and then there were beautiful retention ponds in between the buildings, and you would actually be able to sort of enjoy and also deal with those rain showers that Houston and the rest of Texas received just last year. And suddenly it's a benefit when it rains. You're actually able to enjoy it. And that's why people actually move out here. They're pioneers because of the life quality that they actually have. Suddenly, the same water is usable in many different ways. You can kayak on it, ice skate on it, and swim in it. So the 8 House, to me, and the whole area is really a wonderful way of thinking about city building and making a life that we want to sort of live in. Here you can see the breakdown of the different typologies: penthouses, apartments, row houses, and retail. The retail is actually wider than the housing, and thus we have room for that ramp. Then we have the yellow row houses, the lighter green flats with balconies on both sides, and then again the penthouses are pinched or smaller because they're 2 levels, and there you get the ramp again. So we play with different depths of the different programs in order to get those ramps. So those 3 buildings are very emblematic of the production of our office before 2016. We were, again, finishing about 1 of those projects a year. Since the last 6 months, we have really been able to produce a lot of different projects that have just taken a long time to build. We moved to New York in 2006. And when we came to New York, we absolutely loved its ability to kind of adapt and change. This is a picture from 1940. And when you look at the water's edge, it is pure capitalism. It is pure kind of commercial behavior, like ships in, warehouses, and no one lived on the waterfront because it was dangerous. Now, the last 10 to 15 years, is a complete reversal. So people are totally moving to the water's edge, the blue edge, as opposed to, say, the green edge or Central Park. And these parks are all like linking up. And it's, I think, within a short period of time, of 10, 15 years, we're going to literally be able to bike around the entire perimeter of New York on a bike without ever crossing a street. A remarkable thing when you consider that just 50, 60 years ago, it looked very, very different. I also think that landscape architects are really the rock stars of our time. When you consider that, Times Square has completely changed from a car culture to a pedestrian-friendly place. Hudson River Park, Battery Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Governor's Island. These are all things that became public realm, and architects, many of whom you're going to invite and have speak here, are really only accessorizing that public realm. They're building the buildings on the edges of those spaces. So it's really important for, I think, developers, for architects, and everyone else to really respect the creation of public realm and the actual investment in those public realm pieces as being the very vital pieces that keep cities sort of moving forward. Think about the High Line, for instance, what that has done to the tax base in New York. And I know that here in Dallas, you do have some incredible examples just outside, a few blocks away, of doing just that. So we got our first project in New York 6 years ago called the West 57th, or VIA. It's 710 apartments, and it just finished 6 months ago. So it is a direct result of this new investment along the waterfront. So you see the park that just sort of skirts right by. And it's located very, in between Hudson River and Central Park. And in many ways, the last 50 to 60 years in New York has been driven by a single typology, meaning skyscraper. So truly, if you were building commercial space or residential, somewhere in the city, you would probably put a tower on top of a podium. And the opposite is true in Copenhagen, where we're from. 90%, 95% of all buildings there are courtyards. They don't build high-rises there. It's the exception. So we were kind of fascinated by, here we are, brand new, coming from Europe. What would happen if you married a skyscraper with a courtyard, and the result would be a court scraper, of course. And the court scraper was one because if you look at this site closely, oops, I think I lost that. The site actually is between a 1930s power plant on the left and a trash distribution center on the right. So we wanted to create the courtyard to be able to look inward. But instead of the courtyard being on the ground level like in Europe, we raised the courtyard to the second level. Then we still had the podium that's so important in New York. We raised the northeast corner 44 floors, and we preserved the views of the building behind, so we're a good neighbor. The sun still is able to come into the courtyard, and thus we kind of create this new typology. The building is entirely driven and designed by all of the constraints and the challenges of that site. The city planner had nixed 2 previous designs by different architects for that site, and stated with this project that it was, in her mind, really the right thing to do on the waterfront. Instead of building yet another tower that you see right there, those towers that are lining up against the edge, that takes the views away from everything within the city, we basically allow the site to grow from the water's edge towards the back of the site. And so this was really a chance to, after 6 years of having an office in New York, to finally have a project that was built. It was really, really satisfying. And what Central Park is to the city in terms of kind of its urban space, the courtyard is to this building. The courtyard is exactly 13,000 times smaller than Central Park. It also still has many of the same programmatic elements. There's a meadow, there are places to grill and hang out, there's water features for the kids to play in. So we really learned from Central Park about what is it that people really, really love. And so when you actually move through the park, there's a lot of different vegetation, there's shortcuts, you can take the meandering path. This is a rental building. That's important to state. It's also 80-20, so 80% of the building are market rate and 20% are affordable. And in New York, that means that a 1-bedroom is around $600 a square month for the affordable units, 142 units, and that the same unit is $3,600 for the market rate. And because that's a very high price, there also are a lot of amenities that you receive when living there. There's a pool, and then you have a half-court basketball court all tucked in within the building, a poker room, and then, of course, the units themselves that look out to the central courtyard, as many do. And so it's really a different kind of species of building that, for me, one of the funniest things was because this looked so different, for many years, no one believed, either within the real estate market or even engineers were coming and saying, ooh, that's a really difficult building. And you're like, excuse me? When you build a glass skyscraper, a tower, the biggest force against it is wind. And anyone who has ever had a domino in their hand and blows on it knows that dominoes fall down because of wind. The beauty of this building is actually that you have the fattest foot at the base, and you have the smallest amount of resistance at the head or at the top. So you actually use less reinforced steel. You actually can use a thinner core wall. You actually are able to gain square footage as you move up in the building. So there are many things that I think just because we have kind of made ourselves think that this is the only way to build, and we have created systems and construction techniques, and it's very hard for people to kind of get out of that thinking of a traditional skyscraper. But there are other ways of designing that have other benefits. So what we're hoping to do with a building like this is to show the beauty of having daylight into all rooms. Think of your large footprinted towers of having very little light in the center of the building. Here, all the spaces get daylight. And then just in terms of where you actually are investing money, that you can save money as you build up. The building has double-loaded corridors. It has a single entrance with two elevator bays that go up on either side. That was very important from the client perspective. And yeah, there's many more things to kind of talk about in this building, but there's a few more things to show. So again, in the last 6 months, West 57th is one of those projects. The other one is in Miami. This is 2 residential towers that are for sale, or condos. And here we're really kind of inspired by the Miami vernacular, this idea of kind of having these extended balconies that passively protect the buildings from solar radiation and heat gain. We also were in Coconut Grove, which is a beautiful, lush landscape. So we wanted to really work with that. And then these incredible views out to the water. So those were sort of our 3 main components. And the site in Coconut Grove is one that actually is it's like a shoebox. So it has a very small frontage to the actual water, and it has a front tower and a back tower. And historically, when developers were doing this in Miami, the back tower was always valued less, and the people would pay less money to live there because they were either looking into the back of the front tower, or they just didn't have the same beauty of views. So we decided to play around with that idea, and instead we decided to twist the buildings so that they appeared more side by side. And thus we were able to capture the same value in the back building as the front. We decided that we could get away with this by actually combining everything with a very lush landscape so that it was perceived as one kind of project, not 2 towers. There's also one entrance, one porte cochere that then you get out and you enter into the 2 buildings. So this perception of one entry, one landscape, and then having the same views actually allowed the client tariff group to actually sell the back tower at the same prices. We have a lot of generous amenity spaces. The inside and outside really flows from one into the other. And then we have very kind of generous floor-to-floor heights. We have the largest sliding glass doors that are hurricane-proof. And then, of course, the pool on the roof, which is a must in Miami. So those are kind of projects that show how we're working at a very sort of luxury and a very high end of residential project. Now I want to talk about a project that we got, and I'm sure many of you can really identify with this client. He came about 2 years ago, and there is a shortage of student housing in Copenhagen. 40,000 students live at home with their parents because there aren't enough student houses, and the other sort of units are just too expensive to actually to rent. So this father came to us and he said, "Please help me get my son out of my house." And so that was the job. And what he basically said is we have to find ways to reduce the cost of student housing. And this is nothing new. The idea that we had was to recycle shipping containers. Some of you will know that Denmark is one of the biggest shipping nations around the world. These shipping containers, they have a life of about 10, 15 years, and then they get dumped, many of them, out into the ocean, either to build coral reefs or to just get rid of them when they've gone past their life expectancy. And so we decided to kind of upcycle these shipping containers into homes. And the idea for us was not so much to think about the recycling of containers, because there's many projects that do that, but it's actually to think about the community that you're about to create. And so we were looking at just how these different shipping containers could be positioned, placed, how they could sort of scale, and how many floors could you sort of stack on top. We came up with this prototype of 12 beds, or 12 units. It basically has PV, or photovoltaics, to heat all the water. We deal with waste on the boat. We try to tap into different renewable energies, so it really is almost self-sustaining. And the beauty of these floating homes, in a way, is that you could, in many European cities, you have old coastal towns that used to be industrial. They used to have shipbuilding, or they had some industry. That industry has left, and now they are just these gray zones, or you don't build on them, they're brownfields. So here it's interesting because those are generally in the most central parts of the city. They have all the utilities that go out to them, but no one is allowed to build on the land. So we decided, what if you actually created this ability to kind of create floating villages that then basically tapped into the very sort of utility grid and create student villages. The other beauty is that your bedroom, in essence, has the same view as the 5-star hotel next door, And so we built the prototype in Poland. It has a cement basement that actually goes under the water level. That creates the ballast. Then you take the shipping containers and you arrange them. We tug it from Poland to Copenhagen, and it's now actually lived in by students, including the son of the original dad. He's very proud of that. There's a little landscape element in the center, and imagine that this is your bedroom as you're going to college. Not bad, right? And we are now in discussions with 2 other cities, one in France, one in Sweden, to actually take this to a much higher and larger scalability. So here's a short little video that gives you a feel. Maybe a little bit higher on the volume. Not bad. People, don't close your eyes. So the other thing that Europe has really dealt with over the last 2 years is the influx of war refugees, especially from Syria. I don't know if you know, but 2 to 3 million people that weren't there are there now. And the countries in Europe are actually breaking down, both in terms of infrastructure and actually where to house everyone. And so these, we thought that yes, they were kind of conceived as student homes, but they could actually also serve as kind of temporary refugee homes. These are built to 1/5 the cost of a traditional dorm room bed on college campuses, and they can be built within about 1/3 of the time. So 1/3 of the time and 1/5 of the cost. So these things can be produced and done, and actually you're doing something good by actually upcycling waste that we are dumping into our oceans. So our hope is that this is actually something that can really address certain critical needs in Europe and maybe even here. We also finished just a couple of months ago a project in Philadelphia. This is the old Navy Yards. And the Navy Yards in the 1940s were critical to the wars that were going on in the 40s and also later just creating the massive Navy. Then when those ships left, the idea was to create a business park. And this is a master plan done by Robert Stern. The building in red outline is our site. Robert Stern basically just designed rectangular buildings because it's a spec. This is about the lowest species of building that exists, right? So this is an office spec building with no tenant being built sort of on the periphery of the downtown. And they were going to make one investment, the developer, which was to build a park in the center of all of this by field operations, James Corner. I saw he was here speaking a few years ago. And James Corner had this idea of circles. He went crazy with circles on this site. But then it was strange because all the streets that were, they were building all these streets new. So all the streets are back to rectilinear and to kind of straight lines. So we asked the client, since they were still kind of making the streets, why not actually curve the streets so that basically what you're saying is that the park is more of a priority than the actual building. The building is, in a way, reacting with the park. So we would maintain Robert Stern's master plan on the roof. It would be that rectangle. But then at the base, it would be reacting to James Corner's park. And so that would create, in essence, a building that was also influenced by its surrounding, the ships that are mothballed. And so we basically created a spec office building for about $290 a square foot using precast elements for the facade. And the precaster was hilarious because all they had ever done was precast T and double Ts for parking garages. And then we went there and said, we would like to put your precast on the facade. They were like, what? And they were so proud of this that they brought the entire crew from northern Pennsylvania and had a barbecue when the building was finished. So when you actually look at the scale of those panels, they're pretty serious panels. And then in the center of the building, we decided that when you look at our site is about 2 blocks away from the waterfront. And you know, it's called the Navy Yard, but you really don't see the Navy ships. You don't really know that you're in a Navy Yard when you're in the middle of this site. So we decided that, you know, we were going to make a little periscope in the lobby so that you look up 4 stories, there's a mirror, and it mirrors the very same mothballed Navy ships and brings them down to you. So also, the spec office building, notice that every floor's puncture becomes smaller because as you move up in the floors, you're paying more rent. So we're turning from the orientation that we had given to us by Robert Stern, but then the ships are in a different angle, so every floor goes to the ship angle and then becomes smaller as you move up. So just a sort of note that you can bring that kind of thinking to any budget. It really doesn't have to have those budgets that you saw in the first couple of projects. The fifth project that we just finished is located in Basel, Switzerland. And for any of you guys that know Basel, it's the home of Herzog Demeron. So this is like going into the enemy's, like, it's like, whoa, we gotta, really do well here. Except that in Basel, our site is that white outline at the bottom, and that's the armpit of Basel. So the armpit of Basel is where they dump all the buildings that they don't like in the center of the city. So it's basically all the warehouses, right? And all of the kind of gunk. And they have now built up everything around the city that they now actually realize that this armpit is actually kind of nice. It's kind of close to the city. And we're going to now go in and refurbish and reuse these buildings. We were given this building, Transitlager, a 1970s warehouse, cast in concrete. It is so solid, it is so immaculate, it is so Swiss. It's not going anywhere, right? And they said, okay, make this into residences. This is UBS Bank that hired us. And we were like, okay. So we were trying to figure out, it's very deep, so we were trying to figure out how do we actually bring daylight into it. And of course you could cut a courtyard into it, but we decided to actually add some floors to the top, make a little lightning bolt so that you have these triangular landscape pieces. So we stack the 3 floors, we have the cores, we twist the floors so that they actually allow for that landscape. Everything is rational. Everything is on a column grid. And then, we assemble basically this building into, right now, we, as you can tell, we cut larger windows into the base building from those little tiny ones. And it's fully rented. So this, for the bank, was a pretty massive success, because how do you get people to basically move into a warehouse district? And it also, I think for me, shows that BIG doesn't just do new construction. We also work with existing buildings in many of our projects and then adapt and breathe new life into them. A project that is just finishing as we speak is actually on the west coast of Denmark. This is still leftovers from when the Germans were using the west coast as like their guns and bunkers. So what you see right there with the little dome is a bunker from 1940s that the Germans built, had a big cannon to blow any ship up that was coming from Germany. And what we've been asked is to remake this German bunker into a museum for the local community. It's a very small community, maybe about 20, 30,000 people. And what we've decided to do is to basically incise or cut into one of these dunes, because it's a beautiful dune landscape that you have from the sea. And then basically you walk from the dunes into this museum. You enter into the German bunker, which we just leave as this raw space, into then 4 rooms of this new museum. We try not to have any doors. We just sort of have these cracks and these sort of lean-tos where you're able to sort of move from one room into the other. Everything is super, super minimal in terms of the different materials. And then take a look, that's a cantilever. So there are no columns in these 4 rooms. This is literally carried by the wall and then having sort of everything back tie into the dune. Up above, when you're standing in the courtyard, you can see down into, these are clear story, so you can look down into each of those 4 rooms as you're walking through the dunes. So those are the kind of 6 projects that we are completing and have completed just in the last 6 months. We have about 8 more projects that are all completing by the end of 2017. So this is for us. We're about to produce the same amount of work this last 18 months as we did in the first 15 years of being architects. So it's a really amazing time for us. Now I'm going to just end on showing you a couple of new projects that you may or may not have heard about. We have a site in Hudson Yards in New York, right adjacent to the High Line. And it's for Tishman Speyer, who owns the Rockefeller Center. Now, you know Rockefeller Center from 30 Rock and from all the TV shows, but what you probably don't know is that it is an incredible office building built in the 1930s, where every inch of its roofscape is terraces. And these terraces go all the way up to the top of the rock, which in my mind is really one of the most beautiful observation towers anywhere in the world. And I think that it's a really amazing thing that happened in the 30s, where they wanted to create spaces and places for people. And then I think that we kind of lost a little bit of that, and it became super commercialized, and you don't find the same generosity. You know, if you think about Rockefeller Center has the ice rink. It has beautiful places where public art is displayed. It has gorgeous retail floors that are 3 to 4 levels. It has the roof terraces where you have weddings and sort of family events. You have the top of the rock. We really should ask when towers are built in our cities that they really reintroduce these kinds of public amenities, because we're losing out when everything is just privatized. So our site is adjacent to Hudson Yards, which is, I think, New York's largest construction site. This is what a zoning envelope would look like. You have setbacks for different heights. And there's the High Line, which ends right at the building. So what we decided to do, why not take the High Line into the skyline? And so we take and cascade gardens basically all the way and spiral them up to an observation tower at the very, very, very top. And this was a way to actually extend. Everyone loves the High Line. It's about 6 miles long, and so why not add to that? The beauty of the High Line is just how many different social spaces there are and what you can do. Now imagine if you were working and you had the ability to pop out and have the same experience on different levels of the building. So our hope is that this is, again, a new species of high-rise, that we could start to bring back some of those ideas that were in the 1930s into the way that we actually use our buildings. So this is a typical building, of course, and the idea that you now have to do is to convince someone that the 2-story spaces are important for their office culture. And we do feel that we are finding that there are different types of companies. We're working, of course, on the Google headquarters and with a lot of different media companies. And we're finding that those companies, or the WeWorks of the world, are putting and placing tremendous value on kind of communal spaces, on spaces where you see each other, where you create those connections of just people walking into each other by chance. And that is a very sort of innovative and creative space. So our hope is that we're just completing SD, or schematic design, on this project, and are hoping that will soon go into construction. I'm going to let Bjarke tell about a project that we're doing in Vancouver.
The Flatiron in downtown Manhattan is an architecture born out of a specific moment in New York real estate history, where skyrocketing land value intersected with the advent of steel structure and elevators and transformed a difficult triangular site into one of the most striking landmarks in New York, becoming the namesake for its entire neighborhood. And for us at Big, this is a perfect example of how we like to work. We like our designs to respond to their surroundings. We like them to inherit their attributes from the challenges and potentials of their environments. Like, for instance, this court scraper in Manhattan that combines a courtyard with the density of a skyscraper, creating a warped pyramid on the waterfront of the city. So essentially our buildings end up looking different purely because they perform differently. Take for instance this financial center in Tianjin that inherits its stalagmite silhouette from the structural challenges of building taller than 0.5 kilometer. Or this observation tower in Phoenix that allows the visitors to experience a three-dimensional 360-degree panorama of the surrounding city, almost like a heavenly body hovering above the desert. And finally, that brings us to Vancouver. The first time I arrived in Vancouver, I drove across the Granville Bridge, and I was struck by the beauty of the urban panorama of the slender glass towers rising against a backdrop of the sea and the mountains. And right here where Granville Bridge triforks, we've been invited to reimagine the gateway to the city. This is already a site in transformation. Granville Bridge is being transformed into this pedestrian parkway, almost like a Canadian cousin to the High Line in New York. And right where this new green promenade touches downtown, it's going to create a new urban oasis, which is going to become our new neighborhood. So first of all, we thought, why don't we reimagine the traditional urban podium and turn it into a lively village full of alleyways and plazas for like a dense, lively urban environment of like restaurants and retail underneath a green carpet of grassy roofs and under the canopy of the bridges. And for the tower, there's a general 30-meter setback requirement from all the bridges to ensure that nobody lives too close to the bridge, reducing our tower to this like tall, slender triangle. But also to respect the neighboring park, we had to sort of recede our silhouette to ensure that they get daylight and sunshine, reducing our footprint to only 600 square meters. But then we were thinking, if the 30-meter setback has to do with ensuring a minimum distance, as soon as we rise above and beyond the bridges, we can actually come back out and maximize the areas with the greatest views and the most abundant sunlight. So it almost becomes like this tower turned upside down that actually grows out of a tight spot in a lively city and then expands to occupy the maximum area in the surrounding skyline. In a way, you can see Vancouver House as a contemporary Canadian evolution of the Flatiron that takes the residential high-rise one step further into the future.
So you just saw in a nutshell basically how, again, a project is driven by all of the challenges of those sites that we work within. And again, there's of course a cost for making those cantilevers, but when you actually do the math, there's a 20% upcharge on the structure that you're spending, but you actually have just increased the unit count by 50% in the upper levels. So you've actually created so much value right where you want it, and that makes the basically everything sort of pencil out. The beauty of actually thinking about these things is when you consider that triangular parks or triangular sites occurred when Broadway cuts across the grid in New York. I just learned this recently, and I hope that I'm giving some of you an aha moment. Do you know why Broadway is a diagonal across the city grid? Anybody? It's the ridge. It is the actual ridge of the Manhattan Island, and the water sheds either to East River or to the Hudson. And when you realize that, that is pretty profound. And all of those triangular sites were kind of undevelopable because you didn't want to build 6 stories or 8 stories. With the advent of the elevator, it suddenly became profitable to build those triangular sites, and that's why you have the Flatiron. So technological advancement, even today, there are materials that are being produced that suddenly unlock the very value in other things that have never been buildable upon. So it's also keeping our eyes and ears open to those advancements. So instead of the Flatiron, we created the Fat Iron in Vancouver. And it's under construction and is going to top out at the end of this year.